Hello everyone, today I want to talk to you about how the CEO of JPMorgan Chase in the US said that America's biggest threat isn't China, but its own internal enemies. Also, how can American batteries catch up with China? The head of Ford Motor Company said that after they finished building their battery factory, the Trump administration suddenly canceled the subsidies. In the US-China rivalry, the real competition isn't about capital, talent, or even technology, it's about the system. With the way the US keeps changing its policies overnight, nothing can ever really get done. Ford Motor Company's executive chairman, Bill Ford, publicly expressed his dissatisfaction with the tax reform bill passed by the US House of Representatives in June, the so-called Great America Act. He warned that this bill would make the US government cancel the production tax credits for Ford's battery plant, which could threaten the operation of the factory and the jobs of thousands of people. The previous Biden administration supported the development of new energy. In response to the US government's call, Ford announced in February 2023 that it would invest $3 billion to build a power battery plant in Marshall, Michigan. This plant is expected to be completed in 2026 and will start producing batteries. The factory plans to hire at least 1,700 workers. Considering that Marshall is just a small town with a total population of a little over 7,000, Ford's plan to build a factory is a huge opportunity for the town's economic development. According to the policies during Biden's term, this Ford factory could originally receive government tax credits, but a tax reform bill previously passed by the U.S. House of Representatives has now thrown the situation into uncertainty. This Inflation Reduction Act prohibits tax credits for batteries that use certain components made by Chinese companies or are produced under licensing agreements with Chinese firms. And this Ford factory might have just crossed the red line of this act, because they're using technology from Chinese battery giant CATL to produce their batteries. If this tax credit disappears, it will seriously threaten Ford's factory construction plans. Even though the factory is already 60% complete, it's now stuck in a dilemma with no easy way out. At the factory policy meeting, Ford said that without this government tax credit, it would jeopardize the operations of our Marshall plant. We've already made certain investments based on a specific policy, but after all the money has been put in, the policy changes. That's just not fair. Ford said we've spent a lot of time talking to politicians about this issue. It's a federal issue, but it's also a state issue. Politicians can agree or disagree on these matters. But once a company has invested, don't change the rules, because from our perspective, it's simply a matter of fairness. And changing the rules is simply unfair. Ford also released a letter from over 100 business owners, school leaders, and elected officials from the Marshall area. The letter calls on Congress to keep the tax incentive policy. In the letter, they said that the region has already lost thousands of jobs over the past few years. Trump is backed by oil tycoons, he's passionate about fossil fuels, and he hates new energy. According to a document released by the White House this month titled Ending the Green New Scam, the Trump administration is committed to cutting funding for the globalist climate agenda, while unleashing America's traditional energy production. As a result, the budget for fiscal year 2026 has cut funding for the Green New Scam, and the House passed the Great American Renewal Act by a single vote. In addition to making the tax cuts from Trump's previous administration in 2017 permanent, it also eliminated tax incentives for clean energy. This includes ending the $7,500 tax credit for purchasing electric vehicles starting in 2026, canceling the $4,000 tax credit for used electric vehicles from the end of this year, and revising the tax credits for power batteries. These tax credit policies were originally established under the Inflation Reduction Act passed by the Biden administration in 2022, and were supposed to remain in effect until 2032. It's worth noting that the actual cost of this policy has already far exceeded the initial expectations. The Budget Office's estimated cost for 2022 was $12.5 billion. However, the latest analysis from consulting firm Alpha Partners shows that the total cost of these credits could exceed $20 billion over the next decade. To sum it up this way, first, the US government made a complete U-turn within 3 years. The subsidy policy, which was originally set to last until 2032, was suddenly changed. Companies that had invested based on the original plan are now left at a loss. Ford's battery plant is one such example. Second, Michigan, where Ford's battery plant is located, is a major hub for the auto industry. The governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, is a Democrat, so Ford's complaints won't be of any use. Trump can't even take care of states controlled by Republicans, so why would he bother about the lives of people in a state run by Democrats? By the way, Michigan's governor, Gretchen Whitmer, is also pro-Taiwan. She led the establishment of a Michigan representative office in Taiwan. Last March, Whitmer even led a delegation to visit Taiwan. This pro-Taiwan governor doesn't focus on serious matters, but instead plays politics and cozies up to Taiwan. Because of this, she's basically cut off the path for mainland Chinese companies to invest in her state and help the economy. Third, the problem in the US is a systemic one. The country's overall direction changes every 4 years, and now, the widely recognized issue of climate change has been twisted into a scam, with the entire new energy industry being handed over to China. Looking back at history, if the US hadn't abandoned investment in new energy when President Reagan took office in 1980, how would it be China's turn to take the lead now? With Trump embracing old-world industries, the US really doesn't have much luck coming its way in the future. I also want to talk about how Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JPMorgan Chase, couldn't help but speak out again after seeing Trump act so recklessly. On May 30th, at an economic forum held in California, Dimon said that what the US should really be worried about is not China, but itself. The US should be wary of enemies from within. Dimon said that although China is a potential rival, they actually do a lot of things very well. What I'm really worried about is ourselves. Can we actually work together when it comes to our own actions, values, capabilities, and management? Dimon also warned that the trade deadlock between China and the US is not going to end just like that. He said that in the face of Trump's threats, China isn't afraid, and he doesn't expect China to bow down to the US. Dimon said he agrees with Warren Buffett's view that the US has a kind of resilience as its norm. However, he also warned that this time, things might be different. Dimon stressed that we must work together and act quickly if we want to solve these problems. Dimon pointed out that there are serious mismanagement issues in the US. According to a report released by the Congressional Budget Office last June, the US government's fiscal deficit in 2024 will be $2 trillion, accounting for about 7% of the US GDP. On this issue, Dimon said that if the US falls into a recession and the GDP drops by 7%, the deficit would rise to 10%. According to revised data released by the U.S. Department of Commerce on June 29, the U.S. GDP shrank by 0.2 percentage points on an annualized quarter-on-quarter basis in the first quarter of 2025, which is 0.1 percentage point higher than the initial estimate. Compared to the fourth quarter of 2024, the U.S. economy only grew by 2.4 percentage points. This change in data reflects the ongoing rise in uncertainty caused by U.S. tariff policies, which has led to a decline in business and consumer confidence, affecting the economy. Dimon also warned that excessive government spending and quantitative easing in the U.S. could trigger a collapse in the bond market. At the same time, he predicted that cracks in the bond market could appear in 6 months or 6 years. Dimon made these remarks at a time when Trump's tariff policies have thrown global trade relations into chaos. After Trump sparked a global tariff war in early April, investors rushed to sell off U.S. Treasury bonds, causing bond prices to plunge and the yield on the 10-year U.S. Treasury to see its biggest jump in decades. These investors are now questioning the U.S.'s long-standing position as the world's leading market. At that time, JPMorgan Chase had already warned that a tariff war could push the U.S. economy into a recession. Dimon was worried about problems with U.S. Treasury bonds. In an interview with the Financial Times on April 15, he specifically urged the U.S. government to reach out to China as soon as possible. He said action could start as soon as tomorrow, and the U.S. could engage with China. Decoupling from China should not be the U.S. government's goal. Dimon has led JPMorgan Chase for nearly 20 years and is one of Wall Street's most influential figures. CNBC mentioned that at JPMorgan Chase's Investor Day meeting earlier this month, Dimon said that over the past decade, Chase was the only company with a return rate exceeding 17% for several years. But at the same time, Dimon did not hesitate to warn that the U.S. economy is facing danger. He said that if you look back at the past 10 years, you'll find that quite a few companies had returns of over 17%, but almost all of them nearly went bankrupt. In fact, almost all major financial companies have come close to bankruptcy at some point. He said, "This world is just too harsh." It can be summed up like this. First, Diamond is not pro-China. In the past, he advocated for the U.S. to reduce its reliance on China in areas like rare earths, semiconductors, and 5G infrastructure. Now, he says that America's biggest threat isn't China, but internal enemies. Diamond isn't speaking on behalf of the Chinese government. He just thinks the Trump administration is heading down the wrong path. Second, Trump's aggressive tariff war, especially targeting China, is just shifting the focus of domestic conflicts, but it hasn't actually solved America's own problems, especially the rapidly rising deficit and debt issues. On the contrary, the tariff war could actually trigger a sovereign debt crisis. Third, while Trump asked Musk to cut government spending by $140 billion, a number far less than the $1 trillion he expected, he also greatly increased defense spending. For example, next year's defense spending will increase to $1 trillion, an annual increase of $110 billion. In addition, he plans to spend $175 billion to build the ambitious Golden Dome space missile defense system. The U.S. is now cutting $2 trillion every year. When Diamond saw that the Trump administration wasn't seriously cutting spending, he naturally became extremely anxious about the possibility of a U.S. debt crisis and kept saying how cruel the world is. Fourth, this attitude of the U.S. being sick itself but telling others to take medicine won't solve its own domestic problems. Right now, they're just worried that if the U.S. collapses, it'll drag everyone else down with it.